All right, so we didn't quite get to everything in the last lecture. So we're going to finish up the summary lecture for period 5. We got all the way through in the last lecture to the election of 1860 and how Lincoln's election pushed 7 southern states to secede before he even took office. We know that several more states joined them to break away and make the Confederate States of America. And at that point, we are at Civil War. So as the war breaks out, we're going to talk about some of the key events of the war. But as the war breaks out, both sides have to figure out what their strategies are going to be. For the North, the strategy is sort of summarized by this image here. Okay? There were 3 parts to the North's strategy, and we've taught them before as sort of the ABC plan, right? A was to build an army and attack Richmond, right? Go right at the Southern capital, attack, capture Richmond using military force. The B of the ABCs was the blockade, right? Build an effective navy and blockade the southern coast to prevent the South from being able to import or export. Because the southern economy was so dependent upon cotton sales, the North wanted to make sure that they could not sell their cotton, nor could they import goods that they needed to fight the war. And then the C was to cut the Confederacy in half by taking over the Mississippi River. Right? Control the Mississippi River. Maybe the C could just be control the Mississippi. I don't care. As long as you remember there's a sort of 3-part strategy. And this picture was designed as kind of making fun of that strategy. People who thought it wasn't a great strategy sort of jokingly called it the Anaconda Plan. So you've got the great big snake sort of circling the South. But in reality, it actually turned out to be a pretty darn good plan. Critics of it didn't like it because they thought it was unnecessary. Why are we going to do all that? This war is going to be over in no time, right? But because the war took so long, this Anaconda Plan actually turned out to be a pretty effective strategy. For the South, their strategy was to rely on their advantages, right? The North had tremendous advantages during the war. Greater factory production, greater numbers of people, right? A stronger economy, a more diverse economy. But for the South, they did have some advantages, right? They were fighting on their home soil, so they knew the land.
They had a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think, both sides have a purpose. But for the South, it's the idea of fighting off an invading army, or what you see as an invading army, kind of gives you maybe a boost. And that itself was an advantage. They didn't have to take anything. They just had to fight a defensive war. The North had to come into the South and take it over. The South simply had to hold the South. And of course, the South had greater military leadership, right? A lot of the top officers in the U.S. Army left the Army and joined the South. People like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Joseph E. Johnston, right? Jefferson Davis himself, right, who became the president of the Confederacy, was a military guy. So South is going to rely on those advantages to try to make the North give up. Right? If they can just make it so it's so unpopular that the North no longer wants to continue. All right, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through some key events of the war. Starting with Fort Sumter, I'm going to run through these events. These are all ones that we have talked about before. All right, they are, I think, all on your sheet that has key events. So you've got all those on your notes. And I'm just going to go through a real quick rundown of each one. Again, I'll put the video up so you guys can come back and review it. So Fort Sumter is where the first shots of the war are fired. This image of it, I think, is a little exaggerated, okay? But it is the first shots of the war in 1861, right off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. The North has to surrender the fort. And at that point, Lincoln says, all right, they've opened fire, they shot first, we need to raise an army. And in doing so, calling for an army is what pushes the other southern states like Virginia to leave and join the Confederacy. Fort Sumter, very consequential. Not much happens militarily other than the U.S. gives up the fort, but it's the first shots of the war. The first battle of the war took place at the First Battle of Bull Run, or as the South calls it, the First Manassas. So Bull Run, Manassas, same thing. All right, First Battle of Bull Run. The South wins the First Battle of Bull Run in what really surprised most people in the North. Both sides came in thinking, maybe one major battle and this thing is over. Turned out not to be the case, right? This battle showed that the war would not be over quickly. And that battle takes place in 1861. Ironically, some historians have argued that the war might have perhaps ended quickly after Bull Run had the Confederacy been organized enough to follow up on its victory. You know, had they been able to organize the army and continue pressing forward, they may have been able to capture Washington. Maybe not. But some historians said that was their best chance right there. The next year, 1862, is the Battle of Antietam. This is the first time that Robert E. Lee invades the North, trying to take the fight into the North. And at Antietam Creek in Maryland, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history takes place. The Battle of Antietam.
Deadly, I guess. Is like deadly a good word?
Deadly is a very good word to describe Antietam.
Robert E. Lee let him off there.
Yeah, Lee takes the Army of Northern Virginia up into Maryland. Right? The first time, he's going to invade the North 2 times. This is the first time. And he's met by the Northern Army. They fight to a very bloody tie at Antietam. But it's enough of, Lee takes enough losses that he's forced back into Virginia. And in addition to being such a bloody battle, another reason that Antietam is so important is because it allows Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Antietam wasn't really a victory for the North, but it was close enough to one that Lincoln says, all right, I want to issue this Emancipation Proclamation, but I want to do it from a position of strength. I don't want to look desperate. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. It freed the slaves in states rebelling against the U.S. It did not free all the slaves, right? The border states that had slavery were allowed to keep their slaves. But what's so important about the Emancipation Proclamation is it sort of redefines the purpose of the war to clearly be about ending slavery. Right? It's kind of wishy-washy for the first year and a half of fighting. Lincoln never really comes out and says, okay, we're just going to end slavery. But once he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, the abolition of slavery becomes a major goal of the war. So that was right at the beginning of 1863. Major turning points of the war in terms of making it so the North was very clearly on the path to victory. For the first year and a half, 2 years of fighting, the South is hanging in there. They're doing quite well. They're winning some battles. They're doing better in Virginia than they are in other areas. Right? But they're hanging in there until July of 1863. The South takes two huge blows at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Right? Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, and that's where the second time that Lee invaded the North, he is roundly defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg. He took huge losses and was forced back into Virginia and was really forced to fight defensively for the rest of the war. Simultaneously, at the same time Gettysburg is taking place, Vicksburg is on the verge of falling. Vicksburg is a city on the Mississippi River, and it was the last major southern stronghold. It was the last city keeping the North from achieving that letter C of the Anaconda Plan, right? Controlling the Mississippi River. The day after Lee was defeated at Gettysburg, right, the 4th of July, 1863, Vicksburg surrenders. So those are two huge blows for the South, two massive victories for the North. The general who was in charge at Vicksburg, General Ulysses S. Grant, is taken out of the West, brought to the East, and put in charge of hammering Robert E. Lee's army until they surrender. Grant and one of his closest officers, William T. Sherman, get together and say, all right, we got to figure out a way to end this war. Grant says, all right, I'm going to stay here in Virginia, and I'm just going to hammer Lee's army. Battle after battle after battle. We're just going to keep going after Robert E. Lee. Sherman, I want you to go south, and I want you to capture the city of Atlanta. And when you capture the city of Atlanta, I then want you to cut straight across the state of Georgia using total war. So Sherman's march takes place in 1864 and really into 1865. Sherman's march is an example of total war, where the Northern Army would destroy pretty much everything in its path. They're not going through, as some students sometimes mistakenly think, just like callously murdering civilians, right? That's not what they're doing. But they are going through and they're targeting civilian property, they're targeting civilian populations in terms of food supply. They want the South to feel the hurt of war so bad that they have no choice but to surrender. So Sherman marches across the state of Georgia. He turns north and he marches through the Carolinas, just causing devastation. Probably the last hope for Southerners that maybe they could win the war or come to some sort of peace agreement is the election of 1864. Had Lincoln lost the election of 1864, Southerners hoped that they might have been able to negotiate a peace settlement. But Lincoln wins that election pretty handily. And once Lincoln wins re-election, it's really just a matter of time until the war is over. The end of the war effectively comes in April 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Appomattox Courthouse is where Lee, having had to already abandon the city of Richmond, Lee surrenders to Grant. And then the last major event that I have on there happens just a few days later, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Important to understand that Southerners largely did not rejoice at Lincoln's assassination. Right, John Wilkes Booth kills Lincoln, perhaps felt like that might give some life to the Southern cause, but it was far too late at that point. And Southerners were not, celebrating the assassination of Lincoln. All right, so forgot I had this picture on here. This is kind of a good example of total war. We talk about Sherman's march, just laying waste. And then there's also a picture here of Lincoln's assassination. Right, John Wilkes Booth breaks into the presidential box, kills Lincoln, April 1865. And so that brings us to the last topic of the Period 5 summary lecture, which is Reconstruction. Historians have debated, how Reconstruction might have looked under Lincoln. We don't know 100%, obviously, because he was killed. But Lincoln had given some hints as to what his plan would look like. He had mentioned that states could be allowed to rejoin the Union once 10% of the population pledged loyalty. They took a loyalty oath to the United States. So they had to get 10% loyalty oath, and then they could write a new state constitution that abolished slavery. So that's pretty lenient, really. It's a pretty lenient plan. He wasn't 100% clear on whether freedmen would have the right to vote, but he had indicated that he was open to it, right? Allowing the newly freed slaves, at least newly freed male slaves, to vote. But again, we don't know for sure because he was assassinated before he could actually do anything. And so when he was assassinated, the task of Reconstruction fell to this fella, Andrew Johnson, his vice president. Johnson's plan was actually pretty similar to Lincoln's. and in some ways was perhaps even more lenient than Lincoln's was. Johnson was adamant against requiring states to give blacks the right to vote. Right? He came out and said, no, the South's going to be a white man's government. He was against voting rights for freedmen. And so under Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, or what history books just call presidential Reconstruction, the South begins to elect the same people who led the Confederacy back into government positions. And they also instituted black codes across the South. And so this political cartoon shows, in a lot of ways, how radical Republicans felt about these black codes. Remember, Congress is dominated by Republicans. Johnson's a Democrat. And they look at it and they go, wait a minute, the same people who led our enemies are being elected to government positions. These black codes are taking away the rights of freedmen. The South is basically trampling all over everything that we fought for. They pretty much just reinstituted slavery and aren't calling it that. As you can imagine, radical Republicans in Congress aren't fans of what they're seeing in the South. They can't stand Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Plan. If you remember, a few years ago in 10th grade, we took a look at this. This political cartoon right here, right? It's a showdown between Johnson, who wants to largely take it easy on the South and reunite the country and keep it as a white man's government, and Congress led by radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, who wanted to not necessarily punish the South, but certainly wanted them to respect the rights of freedmen. Johnson battles with Congress over and over. Congress eventually starts overriding Johnson's vetoes. And as we know, they impeach him and nearly kick him out of office. At that point, Congress takes over control of Reconstruction. This is a drawing of those impeachment proceedings, right? And this is Thaddeus Stevens, right? One of the leaders of the radical Republicans who were so against Johnson that they came within one vote of kicking him out of office. So Congress takes over Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction, we'll come back to that. Congressional Reconstruction, very different than presidential Reconstruction. A couple things that they required or added was that Southern states, before they could rejoin, had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Southern states were required to ratify the 14th Amendment. Congress nullified all Confederate money and debt. Nullified is to vacate, to throw out. They said, all right, your money is worthless. So what do you think that does to the Southern economy?
Ruins.
I mean, it's already in pretty bad shape, but right now the entire basis of their economy is gone. Southern states were required to protect citizenship and voting rights of freedmen. And to enforce this, the South was placed under military control. Right? The Army is put in place in the South. It's sort of broken up into districts. And the Army is put in place to administer and protect the rights of these freedmen. Now, Reconstruction, I think, is largely seen as a failure overall, but we do want to think about some of the major accomplishments of Reconstruction. A lot of positive things do happen under the Reconstruction governments. For example, public schools and colleges are available to blacks in the South for the first time. Right? Public schools and even colleges are available to blacks in the South for the first time. Freedmen are able to participate in government by voting. Because they are allowed to vote, you get the very first black elected officials. This man right here is named Hiram Revels, first black man elected to the United States Senate, elected from the state of Mississippi.
What time is this?
Right? I mean, this is all in the Reconstruction time period, right? Late 1860s. Right? Congress pretty much takes over Reconstruction in 1867 and forces the southern states to follow these rules. Under Reconstruction governments, there were also internal improvements to the South. Right? Pictures like this show the destruction, but as you can start to see, rail lines are being built. They're going to start to rebuild parts of the South. Add rail lines, add roads. So there are some accomplishments under the Reconstruction period. But largely, when you read about Reconstruction, you read more about the failures of Reconstruction. All right? So, one area where Reconstruction sees a failure is there was a pretty good amount of corruption in Reconstruction governments. This is a Thomas Nast. We looked at this in class. This Thomas Nast cartoon, sort of making fun of these Reconstruction governments where African Americans were taking part because they were seen by Northerners as corrupt. Now, actually, the most corrupt governments during this time period were actually in the North. But there definitely was some corruption in these Southern Reconstruction governments. And of course, the racism of the day, it was easy to point the fingers and say, well, that's happening because there's black people in the government. They shouldn't be running the government. They don't know how to run the government. Right? And that's obviously not true. But for white Northerners, this kind of shows how the way that they saw these Reconstruction governments. We know that there was also significant violence across the South during Reconstruction. Right? You've got armed crowds, both black and white, and of course the soldiers standing in the middle trying to keep the peace and calm things down. And then, of course, there were groups like the KKK, the Knights of the White Camellia, the White League. That's the one shown here. And so, again, white Northerners taking a look at these Southern governments and going, look at all this violence. We're covering the cost of keeping these troops here to keep the peace. And the cost is really was seen as another major failure. You had cartoons like this, where particularly Democrats in the North were arguing that things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which was there to help freed African Americans get on their feet, find a home, find a job, help make sure that their rights are being protected, they're shown instead in the Northern press as just simply providing a life of laziness for African Americans, right? There's a white person right here working hard to provide for his family, while the taxpayers in the North are paying for African Americans to just kick back, do nothing, take handouts. And again, that's not even remotely accurate, but that is the way it was portrayed. That this was costing the government way too much money. And after a while, the North just sours on Reconstruction. They don't want to continue to pay to protect the freedmen. They don't want to continue to pay for the army to be down there. And without public support, it's really hard to maintain. So that brings us to the last part of our lecture here, the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. The election of 1876 is between these two fellas, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Hayes is the Republican, Tilden is the Democrat. As I said, the North has started to turn sour on the Republicans and their Reconstruction efforts. This election is so close that it comes down to 3 southern states whose election results were contested. It was very, very close. Tilden actually wins the popular vote. The Democrat wins the popular vote. But the electoral votes in 3 southern states were contested. And this thing dragged on for months.
Wait, is it 1866 or?
1876. It drags on for months. And eventually it takes Congress having to decide who the president is going to be. And in early 1877, Republicans struck a deal with Democrats called the Compromise of 1877. And basically the compromise was that the Republican, Hayes, would become president. And in exchange for allowing Hayes to become the president, Republicans would basically bring Reconstruction to an end. They would no longer interfere with Southern elections, and they would send the troops back to their bases. The Compromise of 1877 brings Reconstruction to an end. And gee, what do you think happens once the troops aren't there to uphold the elections and allow freedmen to vote? It goes right back to rule by white people. Right? It goes right back to democratic control, rule by white people, systematic disenfranchisement of African Americans, and a reinstitution of segregation laws. Right? And it's going to go all the way almost 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement, before there's really any meaningful steps forward for African Americans, particularly in the South. Okay?